I'm going to put together a series of podcasts on climate adaptation. I will start with this book from the World Bank called The Adaptation Principles, a guide for designing strategies for climate change adaptation and resilience. Adaptation compared to mitigation is a much more complicated thing since it is very region specific. You are adapting to something that is happening locally, typically regionally, and yet the nations have to prepare their adaptation plans as a national plan with region specific actions. The book itself doesn't look into sectors, how to adapt to let's say agriculture or transportation or infrastructure or energy and so on. It provides overall country level principles and how to develop strategies. Mitigation, on the other hand, you are generally focused on reducing emissions, sticking to global warming targets of 1.5 degrees C by 2100 or 2 degrees C. You have nationally determined contributions which are largely aimed at reducing country level emissions and so on. So this is kind of difficult to come up with blueprints that will apply everywhere, and yet this book provides some strategies on how to do that and looks at various foundations. So here, rapid, robust and inclusive development is the foundation envisioned for adaptation strategies with priority areas. Priority area 1 here is facilitate the adaptation of people and firms. So countries consisting of various businesses, industries and so on, which need to be facilitated in terms of their adaptation to climate change, make them more resilient, and of course help people deal with the climate issues of the region. Priority 2 here then becomes adapt land use plans and protect critical public assets and services. We'll look at the details of each with multiple examples and toolboxes on how these priorities are to be met, what kind of metrics are to be used, what kind of tools are available, and so on. Priority area 3 then becomes help firms and people manage residual risks and natural disasters. After all the adaptation is done, each season comes with its own extreme events, climate hazards, chronic risks and acute risks. So cyclones, for example, are acute risks, whereas chronic risks are rising sea level, warming temperatures and so on, or maybe reducing rainfall over the years or decades. Priority area 4 consists of manage financial and macro fiscal issues. These are kind of economic terms which climate people don't necessarily know. Financial economic policies of a country include financial part and the monetary parts. So financial or fiscal parts worry about tax revenues and expenditures, and financial monetary policies include central banks on setting interest rates, flow of money, etc. And then micro-fiscal and macro-fiscal refer to country level GDP level issues versus individual businesses, etc. There are also micro and macroeconomic issues about supply and demand versus national level economic considerations, issues, and so on. So obviously I'm not an economist, and I'm just going to do the best to provide you the background on where these strategies will be applicable. But remembering the book itself is focused on not sectoral issues but national issues. We will only worry about financial and macro fiscal issues, and this will become clearer as we go forward. Application then is on prioritization, implementation and monitoring progress. There are many other podcasts where I've talked about maladaptation and so on, where countries may do adaptation to something like sea level rise based on current understanding. Then in a few years it may become not the best thing to have done, or you're adopting some crop as changing temperatures and rainfalls indicate something, and then it may turn out to be a poor choice in the end in terms of adapting agriculture. Some of these examples exist, so we'll look at case studies from other books in terms of how adaptation actually works. And this is the difference between mitigation and adaptation, that adaptation tends to be lots of case studies, and then you look for transferable solutions from one experience in one place, see if that can be applied elsewhere, and so on. So generally it's a very difficult thing. The contents themselves are as this: adaptation principles, a summary, which is what we are starting here. So we'll look at foundations. As we mentioned, rapid, robust and inclusive development is the first priority. Priority area 1 is facilitate the adaptation of people and firms, which we already showed in the loop around the globe. Priority area 2, adapt land use plans and protect critical public assets and services. I'll repeat these things again when we come back to the details after the summary podcasts are done, but it's okay to repeat these things so that you can reinforce the ideas. Help firms and people manage residual risks and natural disasters is priority area 2. Managing financial and macrofiscal issues is priority area 4, with applications focusing on prioritization, implementation, and monitoring progress. So under introduction, we will look at the details. So increase economic productivity and growth while keeping buffers for shocks, climate shocks, chronic or acute shocks. Ensure that economic growth is inclusive under this. And under priority area 1, you have various action items. So we'll look at the details of those. Priority area 2 has some action items, priority 3, and of course priority 4. And application in terms of prioritization, implementation, and monitoring progress. There are action items such as create a strong institutional and legal framework with appropriate stakeholder involvement, which is always important. Co-producing solutions becomes important for people to be able to engage in the exercise itself and being believers in what this adaptation government is trying to do. We'll see some private actors also have to be involved, and so on. Then we'll look at Annex 1 and Annex 2 in terms of the illustrative list of indicators and actions outlined in this guide. So lots of ideas provided assume indicators. For example, when you say create a strong institutional legal framework with appropriate stakeholder involvement, how do you actually use metrics to do that, especially in terms of prioritizing and implementation, and especially so for monitoring progress? You cannot monitor progress unless you have defined some metrics. In Annex 2, we look at example of indicator-based identification of policy priorities. Okay, so keep that in mind. The actions pertain to 6 principles of climate change adaptation, which correspond to the common policy domains, and we'll look at a figure later on, which actually we already looked at, the globe. Ensure development is rapid and inclusive and offers protection against shocks. Facilitate the adaptation of firms and people. Adapt land use and protect critical public assets and services. Help firms and people cope with and recover from disasters and shocks. Anticipate and manage macroeconomic and fiscal risks. Prioritize, implement, and monitor interventions. These are what adaptation always includes. We'll look at this table. It goes from bottom up. So this is about priority areas and concrete actions for climate change adaptation and resilience policy as an overview. So we first start with robust foundations, which include rapid, robust, and inclusive development being the first priority. And it is envisioned that this will fall under the Ministry of Finance and Economy, with action F.1 corresponding to increase economic productivity and growth while keeping buffers for shocks, and ensure that economic growth is inclusive. How do you do that? That's a principle. So a strategy, tactics, and policies are needed to make sure that that happens. So this then feeds into priority areas 1, 2, 3 and 4 that we already talked about, and then those feed into application in terms of prioritization, implementation and monitoring progress. Here lead ministries are seen again as finance and economy and agency in charge of climate change. In India, for example, there is a Ministry of Earth and Environmental Science, Environment, Forestry and Climate Change, MOEFCC. Okay, so each priority areas will also have ministries associated with them, as we will see later on, and you can see that here. So priority area 1, facilitate the adaptation of people and firms, falls under lead Ministry of Economy, and priority area 2, adapt land use plans and protect critical public assets and services, is seen to be falling under economy, planning, investments or infrastructure. So these are also dependent on each country on how they do this. Priority area 3 for helping firms and people manage residual risks and natural disasters is here seen as Interior or Environmental Ministry responsibility, and priority area 4 on managing financial and macro fiscal issues is under Finance Ministry, and then we'll look at the details of these action items in each of them. Okay, this guide contains practical tools, concrete examples and other information to guide decision makers through the principles of adaptation and help governments formulate effective strategies that enable their societies to thrive in a time of climate change. These include screening questions, so each section we will see a bunch of screening questions to identify the most urgent and effective actions to increase climate resilience and guide the selection of priorities. Then toolboxes offering concrete quantitative examples of how these questions can be answered using commonly available data and methods. I'll do my best to translate these. Indicators and targets to monitor and evaluate progress toward the objectives mandated by a national adaptation strategy. So in Annex 1 we'll look at the proposed indicators or targets though the list is not exhaustive and other options are available, but those are good examples which will give you a sense. It also provides in each section COVID-19 spotlights, which should serve as a paradigm for collective human action, how humanity dealt with the pandemic, what were done well, what were not done well, what lessons we have to learn for the future, not just to deal with future pandemics but to actually deal with climate adaptation. Okay, so providing information on how the current health and economic crisis changes the priorities and the preferred solutions for building resilience and adapting to climate change. Okay, so I'll leave this introduction here. Hopefully either it'll excite you to continue or you can see the book yourself. I'm tinkering with the camera as I'm recording this, but you get the idea, and we'll come back and look at first the foundations and then look at priority areas and then look at actual